an economy in recession, unemployment at 10 million and rising, a fiscal crisis without a strategy to deal with it, all of this compounded by our descent into junk status. Since then, of course, the lockdown shock to the South African economy is very large indeed, with estimates of our GDP declining by between -7 and -17% this year. The budget deficit has exploded and will be somewhere north of 10% of GDP. We truly do not have anything left in the cupboard, and lenders will be even more skeptical of our ability to repay new borrowing. So how do we mobilize the resources we need to fight the epidemic and address the huge hardship that lockdown and social distancing measures have imposed? How do we hold on to much of our economy, to as much of our economy as possible? We have an excellent panel this morning. We will structure our time by asking Michael to present for some 16 minutes or so. And then I'll ask Lumkile Mondi and Gina Schoeman to comment for 7 minutes. And I will be tight on managing the time, everybody. And then we'll get into a conversation. And for those of you sending in questions, please make them as short as possible. I know this is a complex subject, but as short as possible. So I don't think we could have a better person to present today than Michael Sachs, with his years of experience heading up the budget office in National Treasury. And so without any further ado, I'll turn to Michael.
Thank you, Anne. Let me share my screen now. Okay, have you got it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I will try and squeeze everything into 17 or 16 minutes, sorry. So this is really the outline of the argument. First of all, the macroeconomics of the coronavirus shock are unique. And this almost impels us to engage in large fiscal operations. Because of the nature of the shock, the cost of not financing these operations is unambiguously greater than the cost of financing them, even though we face financing pressures, even at a higher interest rate. But government does face a binding financial constraint. So responding to the situation means that we will have to get external official creditors wherever possible. We will have to look at deploying the whole public sector balance sheet, and that includes the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank and the pension funds in the public sector and the UIF and others. And we need to make sure that we do maintain government access to capital markets while doing those things. And there's some dilemmas there. So ultimately, whether this approach succeeds is uncertain. Because there is fundamental uncertainty about how the pandemic itself will play out right now in South Africa, and the post-pandemic world is, we don't know what it will look like. So certainly we can say now that without an effective reconstruction of South Africa's path of growth and distribution after the crisis, South Africa will face years of debt distress. And I think it's important to understand it as a challenge of growth and distribution, because there will be massive redistributional as well as structural reform consequences of the crisis. So I'll try and say all of that in a few minutes. So the first point is that how do we think of this shock? There's a sense in which it's a normal, but this is an extraordinary shock. It's a social choice, or it's both, but this there's an element which is extraordinary. It's a social choice to reduce potential output and restrain aggregate demand. So, and the authorities, the government, the same government that wants to, in some people's view, stimulate the economy, is through decrees, essentially, reducing potential output and aggregate demand to the minimum consistent with disease management objectives. and the objectives of social order. So the central issue is not really an output gap. And the central issue is not stimulus, as many people continue to talk. Instead, the issue is that how do you balance, on the one hand, regulated levels of output and employment, and on the other hand, the flows of income that come from that production? How do you ensure that the flows of income continue to flow in terms of employment and wages and all the payments that need to be made, while you are, on the other hand, as government or as society, holding down the opportunities for production? These flows can become decoupled. So there are problems of matching supply and demand, but the central macroeconomic issue is really hysteresis. That while this potential output is reduced to its bare minimum, how do you prevent the balance sheets of households and firms from becoming so damaged that, and the relationships between workers and their employers so damaged that once the crisis passes, your potential output is significantly lower than it was when the crisis started? That to me is the central macroeconomic challenge right now for the next 6 to 18 months. So there's all kinds of, we don't know what the shape of the shock is, but we do know, I think what I'm emphasizing here is the mega hysteresis risk, for want of a better description. That's really the central challenge, both for households that will see significant damage in the poorer sector of the population, that will find their significant damage inflicted on themselves by a reduction in consumption levels, which will undermine human capital in households in very fundamental ways if we allow it to happen, reducing our potential output afterwards. But also in the relationships between workers and firms and between and the balance sheets of firms. So the key macroeconomic objectives, I would say now, is not stimulus, but it's first stabilizing the flow of income to prevent a consumption shock. It's secondly providing some form of bridging finance to allow private and household and firm balance sheets to survive and remain liquid. But in my view, this is a shock that will bring us down to a lower level of income. So we're not going to have a V-shaped recovery. We're going to have what BASA calls, or not BASA, what the Business South Africa calls an L-shaped recovery, which I've always thought is a bit of an oxymoron. Every rand spent on reducing the impact on the virus has a massive return in terms of future welfare of society, and the return is so huge that it doesn't make sense not to allocate as much as you can to fight the virus in any economic sense. We also need to relieve social distress, backstop wages, and underwrite credit extension. And I would argue that the same logic, sound public finance logic, underpins all of those operations. The cost of not doing them is much higher than the cost of doing them, even though we have a financing constraint. The initial responses, in my view, need to be large. So the IMF added the word large to their oft-repeated triad of temporary, timely, and targeted. In the latest WAO, they talk about large, temporary, timely, and targeted. And that's what we need to do here. We need to execute with speed using existing channels, which is social grants, which is SARS, the revenue service, which is the banking system potentially. And we need to emphasize scale over targeting. And this is the initial response that I'm talking about. The most difficult part of the fiscal response will be its temporary nature. And this applies both to the fiscal and monetary response. One of the instruments perhaps that you can use to help with the unwinding of the fiscal and monetary positions is to ensure that the public financing of the response is quarantined. So that would require you to have a separate budget presentation and a separate financing strategy attached to the budget for the fiscal operations that are necessary. But of course, now for some reason okay, I won't go through this one. This just sets out the fiscal response in a bit. Yeah. So of course you face a financing constraint. We would like to do all of these fiscal operations, but unlike the European Union or the USA or Japan, we don't have unlimited financial firepower. And the best indicator of that is the bond yield on 10-year bonds, which has increased by about 2 percentage points since the crisis hit us. And note that at the same time that our bond yield skyrocketed, the US bond yield fell through the floor, which immediately tells you that there's something very different from the financial constraint that we face and the financial constraint that the USA faces. This comes from the Institute for International Finance. It shows bond yields on the horizontal axis, the change, and exchange rate on the vertical axis. So you see the USA massively expanded spending, a $2 trillion package, the biggest in history. And that resulted in bond yields improving and the exchange rate appreciating. South Africa saw a massive fall in its exchange rate and increase in its bond yields, even though we didn't announce anything. And interesting about this graph, I think it's the first time that South Africa has been such a large outlier in a global shock. So South Africa is one of the worst hit on both counts and is a massive outlier. The reason, in my view, is that there are fundamental underlying concerns about South Africa's fiscal sustainability. And just to illustrate what to me encapsulates these concerns, the dotted line shows the debt trajectory of the G7 economies. You saw that going into the 2009 financial crisis, they had a stable debt position as a collective. The crisis hit them and they took a shock of about 40% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio, and then stabilized again. The same is true of the other groups shown in this graph. South Africa, in contrast, shows a path of escalating debt trajectory. So prior to the coronavirus crisis hitting us, our debt was on an unstable path. It's not about the level of debt, it's about the trajectory. There was no plan on the table to stop that trajectory. So while in the advanced economies, we are also going to have, they are talking about another 40% debt to GDP ratio. The expectation is that after they absorb that shock, they will be in a stable position, whereas that is not the case for South Africa. I'll skip over these in the interest of time and then go to, then how do we deal with this problem? What do we do? So we need to be very careful. We need to finance as far as we can the fiscal operations that are absolutely necessary by reallocating resources from fiscal operations that maybe are not so necessary. And one of those is any asset forming expenditure. So you could imagine, for example, the housing grant. What we need is a massive temporary reallocation of budgets from areas that are not essential in the current fiscal year to areas that are essential. So any kind of capital projects or asset forming expenditure can be postponed until the next year. That should be shifted into grants. Secondly, and other fiscal operations related to the crisis. Secondly, we need to draw on surpluses across consolidated governments, such as the UIF surplus. If we want to use, I mean, there's a potential for government to substantially reduce its wage bill by only paying basic salary, and that would in effect be drawing down on the GPF to finance fiscal operations in the current environment. We need to keep taxation on the agenda, not least because once this is all over, there are going to be massive distributional questions that South Africa is going to face. So we need to start this discussion now. I have suggested a temporary and modest surcharge on the back of existing tax instruments or PIT. I don't expect it to generate that much revenue in the current environment, but we need to begin asking ourselves, how are we going to encourage a greater contribution from high net worth individuals in South Africa? It's very good that they've donated to make charitable contributions, but we really need to have a conversation about taxation. So lastly, we have to ease pressure on the bond market, and reprioritizing spending and taxation are two ways of easing pressure on the bond market. A third is official foreign creditors, not limited to the IMF. I think we can, if we had an effective diplomatic campaign, we would probably be able to finance our entire, the entire package announced from external sources. It's possible. Given the exchange rate. at interest rates that are far below what the market is charging us. And I don't think, to me, this is a no-brainer, especially as very little conditionality is being applied. Secondly, we do have large cash balances in the National Revenue Fund of around 250 billion that we need to ask how much can we draw them down by. As I've said, fully deploy the surplus of the UIS, consider the appropriate use of the GPF. And of course, in borrowing strategy, we're going to see an erosion of the quality of the portfolio of government debt. That is unavoidable. Part of that will be moving down to the short end of the curve, by borrowing at lower interest rates, but on shorter terms, shorter maturities. And the second is foreign borrowing, dollar-denominated borrowing. Both of those things place us in greater risk going forward, no doubt about it, but they are necessary given the risks that have materialized right now. So the second point here is that we really can't conduct ourselves in a way that will threaten disorder, market disorder. We want to fund ourselves, keep bond markets open, and funding ourselves as the public sector at sustainable rates. The danger we face, which the US doesn't face, which Japan doesn't face, which Europe doesn't face, is a disorderly capital flight and a collapse of domestic asset prices. That is a real challenge that we need to think about. Whatever we want to do, how do we avoid that outcome, right? But at the same time, we need to negotiate with the holders of domestic assets. I've suggested a solidarity bond, some kind of concessional instrument that they buy into in order to help fund the current situation. There's a broad spectrum of kind of voluntary schemes, but there needs to be a negotiation. Ultimately, the risks that we're taking onto the public sector balance sheet, if they don't turn out to be, if the gamble doesn't turn out well, it is the domestic asset base that we will have to negotiate with in addressing that problem. So I think that the way to think about some of the things Lumkile was talking about, monetization and that, is that the credibility of the SARB is an anchor around which our domestic asset prices are sustained. We need to be thankful for that, the credibility and that anchor, but we also need to ask, what more? If we had a Reserve Bank that was not credible, it would certainly not be able to monetize without a disorderly collapse in asset prices. Given that we have a SARB that is credible, what can it do to ease the funding pressure? Can it influence long-term rates? It's done so to some extent already. How much further can it go over the next 6 to 18 months? It's something that we need to think about and handle carefully. Lastly, we do need to have a discussion about macroprudential measures and capital account regulation, which means some more restraints on capital flight, essentially, but in a responsible and orderly manner that enables greater funding from the domestic asset base. There's all kinds of pressures and debates about monetization, in other words, printing money, and compulsory finance, forcing domestic funds to pay or lend the money to government. These debates are unlikely to go away, not least because they are massive debates also across the world. And but I think we should avoid being crude. There are many ways to skin these cats that need to be on the table. So we shouldn't take a crude position, which I think a lot of people on the left are taking, which is just print the money. And then there's a crude position on the right, which is that we couldn't possibly take any assets onto the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank. It's the problem of the fiscus, and the fiscus must deal with it. Both of those positions are problematic, and there's a huge range of possibility between those extremes that we need to start thinking about. So that's it. My conclusion is just the same as my summary at the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Lumkile, let's turn to you. I know you've read Michael's paper. This is very unfortunate. And you have an idea of what his positions are. Perhaps you could raise some issues on what he's been arguing, and also what you think of what government's been doing so far. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Good morning to everyone. Firstly, I just want to highlight that the CDE, as well as work done by Professors Estienne Kalitz and Philippe Berger, before the pandemic started, had shown that the lower levels of growth in the past 10 years were threatening both our physical sustainability as well as the development, particularly on the social side, that both those programs were going to be threatened if there was no growth in the economy. That having been said, is that the pandemic catches us in a very difficult period, as highlighted by work done by CDE, that the state was facing huge challenges in terms of managing its debt and therefore what it was going to do about it, specifically structural economic reforms. So what Professor Sachs has put today on the table is a very timely intervention, and it highlights the challenges of countries that have been running unsustainable fiscal position, that in a pandemic or an external shock, they find themselves reeling, trying to find ways of how they can finance the challenges that are posed by the pandemic. I just want to look forward in terms of what I think Mr. Sachs, Professor Sachs' paper should have said, specifically focusing on three critical areas, which I believe that can alleviate the pressure on the fiscal, on fiscal policy, specifically on the new budget that Professor Sachs is suggesting. Firstly, is to look specifically on cutting some of the SOEs funding that have got no potential of ever developing and repaying any of the debt back to government in terms of the guarantees that have been given by government. Secondly, is to look also whether is there space for privatization of some of the position that government has. For example, government has got a huge exposure at telecom because that can free some money. People might argue that the timing may not be correct, but we're in a pandemic, we're in an emergency, so we have to think innovatively. Thirdly, I think there's an opportunity that perhaps might be available in phase 3 when the president talks to us again, specifically relating to how do we ensure that we don't stretch ourselves too far on the fiscal side, which will allow us to continue borrowing from capital markets. Is there space for the South African Reserve Bank to print some money, what people have been talking about, Professor Kanto and many South African academics that believe in the modern monetary theory, who argue that any printing of money as an emergency, let's say if we print about 200 billion rand worth of rands as an emergency to target particular areas, is that we're owing to ourselves. So it's a debt that is ours. There's no interest rate on it. However, this is a temporary measure. It's not going to be a continuous printing of money. So I think that's an area that I think we need to think innovatively around that. And as a desperate measure as well, is to look at whether in an emergency and a strategy to revive the economy to address the issues that Professor Sachs so well put around the output gap and the opportunity of increasing output and ensure that we can sustain some incomes. Whether is there a role for the institutional finance industry, specifically looking at what will it mean for us to prescribe some assets as a source of funding. As the last comment, I just want to make sort of 3 observations. That we have had a regime that has been saved by the pandemic. Remember, this regime has been not credible. Some of the people in the cabinet implicated in the Zondo Commission. So some of these pandemic responses have shown also the inability of dealing with corruption, particularly in food parcels and other areas where we want to reach out to the poor to try and offset the impact of the pandemic. Secondly, which I believe in my sense quite important, is that if therefore if there's no credibility with the government, how then does the government summarily issue a notice of the extension or of deploying more of the South African Defence Force into the security services, and how these roadblocks are being reminiscent of apartheid and some form of totalitarian behavior, which we last saw in the apartheid regime. So the credibility and how the state is behaving in this pandemic raises quite a lot of issues around the security. Of course, I know that this is a serious crisis, so we're encouraged by the intervention around making sure that the state continues to address the challenges of the poor. But the behavior of the security cluster should be watched much more carefully, because I think any of its action is perceived by many of us as really a danger sign about the future of South Africa, and whether in fact the compact that the president is talking about is possible when the state is showing some signs we last saw in the apartheid regime. Lastly, there's three areas that I would like to see happening. Is the area around the phase 3. The phase 3 that the president and the Mr. Foreign will talk to should look into climate change and health, look into work, livelihoods, and how those be integrated in a changing technology environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lumkile. I'm going to turn now to Gina Schoeman and ask her to talk for about 7 minutes. Gina.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Hi, everyone. You know, the risk of going third is that I might echo what both Lumkile and Michael have already said, but please, if I do echo it, please see that as an emphasis on some of the things they've said. I think the overarching message from my side here is that Michael's assessment that he's just taken us through the paper, the presentation, it's a very holistic, which is very important for South Africa given our dire socio-economic needs. It's sensible, and where I think it starts to move South Africa forward is that it's realistically less orthodox, let me rather say, than unorthodox, but less orthodox than the type of quite relatively strict orthodox policies that South Africa has been managing up until this period. And I'm in no way criticizing what we have done so far. It's just that this is a monumental crisis. And I think it is key to quote what Michael put in his paper, which is a Draghi quote, and I'll just summarize it very quickly by saying, the key question is not whether, but how the state should put its balance sheet to good use. So I take the point that Michael just made, Lumkile also referred to it. We have a very credible South Africa Reserve Bank. And yes, of course, that could allow us to make use of the public sector balance sheet more so. The thing I want to address is also having a credible growth outlook going forward. Because in the end, we're very much dealing with what government described as phase 2 at the moment. The economic fiscal stimulus following on from monetary policy that we've seen so far in trying to address this monumental crisis that we are dealing with. But we mustn't lose sight of phase 3. And I know we still have a lot of detail that we have to receive from government in terms of both phase 2 and phase 3. But phase 3 is absolutely critical if we're going to think even 2 years out. A macro monetary policy, fiscal policy response has to take on more risk. But this can only succeed if the growth outlook improves, but is also believed to be able to improve. So the phase 3 reforms after COVID should actually be, they should be started right now. And that's a part of Michael's paper that I think is very important, very critical. He speaks about the need to separate the COVID action versus the rest of government operations. That means we can't pour absolutely all of our energy into just addressing the immediate needs of the country given the virus. We also need to pour a lot of energy into what this economy can do in order to get past the virus and thereafter. In regards to this, when we start thinking about the financing needs of South Africa and the bond market, you know, without a credible plan to improve growth, unfortunately, some of the financing options will fall short, will just fall to pieces. And I'll give you two quick examples here. It's fine to issue bonds at the front end of the curve. But if you don't have credible growth going forward, that is also believable by those bondholders, you're going to also end up in a massive refinancing risk. Similarly, South Africa has a relatively high foreign ownership of its bond market. Now, if we issue more foreign currency denominated bonds, we're obviously going to increase this ownership, this foreign ownership. The LATAM example here shows that a foreign bondholder of a country's debt is going to look at the country and ask, how on earth are you going to pay this back? And typically, if you don't have a growth track record, they still want to see a degree of austerity. But please, let me just make known, I'm not talking about austerity that will necessarily hurt who is already being hurt. I'm talking about looking within the budget, taking out the expenditure that is truly wasteful, that is not giving us any multiplier effect across the economy. There are surely so many line items that South Africa could be more clever about, more sensible on, in order to increase the multiplier effect of expenditure. I don't think there's even a debate at the moment as to the income, wage, and job support. In Michael's paper, I think he hits the nail on the head perfectly. The social well-being aspect of all of this must trump all else. But that says, there is something to think about when we think about the temporary stimulus that is being provided. You know, I would appreciate both Lumkile, Michael, or anyone really on the call to potentially have a discussion about how do you actually remove a temporary top-up on a social grant. You know, realistically speaking, in 6 months' time, to walk up to someone at such a low income level receiving a grant and say to them, well, we think you're now fine, so we're going to remove the temporary top-up. I think realistically that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think that a lot more debate is necessary there. So let me end up on just a couple of final points. This crisis will expose, and I think is already exposing, what the country and Ramaphosa's true capabilities are. And that is always the usefulness of a crisis. I'm not saying we're not a capable state. I think we have found that even in the last couple of weeks, we have managed to adjust to new types of policies and ways of thinking already, and I think that's very healthy. But bottom line is, without a capable state that is able to ensure better growth, a stimulus plan will eventually fail anyway. And then finally, just to end off on something that perhaps a couple of people have always heard me go on and on and on about, Lumkile being absolutely correct to highlight not to stretch beyond our fiscal means. And I would add, this could be taken not to stretch ourselves beyond our economic means. I think we have to be very realistic about what our means actually is. And this is where I always try and describe South Africa in its equilibrium state. Now, it's far more of a theoretical concept than it is a quantitative one. Otherwise, we could debate forever what the actual equilibrium is. But to give you a quick sense of this, our very, very old equilibrium was typical 3% real growth, 8% nominal growth. You get your deflator of 5% between the two, which is your higher inflationary environment. Your national budget deficit under those conditions was about 3% of GDP. Then we moved to what I called a new equilibrium, which is now the most recent one, where we had, and I'm probably being still quite generous for where we were, let's call it 1% real growth, 5% nominal growth, your deflator squeezing there, showing your lower inflation environment because of your wider output gap. So the natural budget conditions you have under that equilibrium would be 6% of GDP. We are now in extraordinary situation where Michael states in his paper, we have this temporary push out of the budget deficit. Our numbers is that the budget deficit to GDP ratio will reach at least 14% of GDP this year. The trick is trying to work out what it reverts to. And this is where it's very clouded. What new equilibrium do we fall onto post-2020? Because I think it's very important to be realistic about this. We cannot assume, like I think many policymakers did over the last 3 years, that we're capable of going back to an old equilibrium literally tomorrow. Going back to an old equilibrium, it takes a long time, and it takes some really tricky, difficult, harsh measures. And I think we have to be very realistic about what type of economy we will end up being, and what type of tolerance we need in terms of policy making going forward. So that's my 5 cents. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to Lumkile and Gina for very interesting points. I'm going to just pose 1 or 2 questions to Michael, let him have another go. And some of these are coming through in all the questions, and I'm summarizing greatly. I think there are a few really important issues that are coming out, and it would be useful to get Michael's point of view. One of them, coming through all the questions I'm skimming on the sort of virtual line, can be summarized this way. You emphasize very strongly in the summary of your presentation, Michael, the importance of South Africa getting growth going. So in your view, how soon do we start talking about this? Is it, a lot of people are saying you've got to wait. You can't do this till we have an economy up and running. On the other hand, we know that we need growth to deal with this massively expanded debt. So that's the first question, the timing on this in your view and your knowledge of government. The second is the issue that Gina has posed, and a number of questions are being asked around this, which is, once you introduce more money to people who have so very little, the grants and the increase there, how on earth will a democratically elected government heading into local government elections wind this back? So how do you see these issues? And then let me end there and ask you to comment.
I hope you can hear me. So I think on the issue of kind of getting growth going, we have to start off with a view or talking about the capacity of the state. And in this context, we shouldn't be thinking of the state as meaning the cabinet. We should be thinking of a much broader concept of the state that includes business and organized labor and the social partners. How, as a kind of political leadership in the country, how much capacity do we have? And I would argue that right now, the coronavirus crisis and its policy and macroeconomic and social consequences are a big thing to be dealing with. And if we want to also at the same time place complex policy reforms on the agenda to do with a future growth agenda for I mean, we also have a very wide uncertainty. I mean, the other day I thought, will there be an oil industry after this? Right? What will happen to the oil industry globally? It's like it boggles your mind that the amount that the global situation might change. So to craft to take Treasury's document of last year and say we must implement these structural reforms now, I think I would argue against that from a state capacity point of view, and also from just a policy point of view, that we really need to focus on responding to the crisis. That said, if our state, meaning the capital, business, labor, and government, is unable to construct a social compact that drives forward a path of fundamental, you can call it structural reform or economic transformation, and new ideas about distribution, if we can't do that, then indeed we will find ourselves, and look, this is kind of my baseline expectation, is that we are going into a period of debt distress, that South Africa will find itself much more in a position of a developing country than in a middle-income country in the global order of things. So secondly, on the second, so I think the growth agenda, I'm not discounting it, it is fundamentally important. And all of this stretching of the public balance sheet, as Gina says, is absolutely correct, that if we don't get the real economy and production and productivity and all of that moving after this, then those liabilities will still be on our balance sheet, and we will have to impose them either on our taxpayers or on the beneficiaries of social programs. So the second thing is maybe related to that is how do then do we withdraw? And this indeed is the central problem, is the temporary nature of these interventions. And time will tell. I have an idea that it may be that as we emerge from the other side of this crucible, that our state is a much more narrowly focused state, narrowly focused on taxation, the payment of salaries for workers who are providing benefits in kind, particularly teachers and nurses and the healthcare sector and the education sector. So taxation that funds salaries and transfers. And that because our kind of economic trajectory is not clear, we are unable to revert back to the kind of fiscal structure that we had before we introduced these temporary measures. And we're left with a much more narrowly tax and transfer state without the pretensions of a developmental state that we've been trying to pursue for the last 20 years. And that many people would see as a major problem, but it may have opportunities in it. Because in my view, really we should be thinking about the developmental role of the state, not as a problem of fiscal capacity, but as a problem of regulatory capacity, the capacity of the state to regulate and interface with capital rather than to shift money around. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Can I ask you two more questions, perhaps more political? The one, well, firstly, where would you be looking in the current budget for this 130 billion of savings that the president has announced? That's the first issue. The second is, has COSATU really agreed to South Africa going to the IMF, or is that a battle still to come? Where are we on that issue, in your view? Let's talk a bit about the politics. And I suppose the third is, if South Africa were to seriously look at privatizing those non-essential things that might be done that don't have to be owned by the state, do you think there's a lot of money to be raised there, or is it minuscule? How big is that quantum if one could move towards a more privatizing approach?
Okay, so the privatization, again, I mean, it's like what might be good in theory might not be the best thing to do right now. So I assume that, I don't know what's going to happen, but I assume with SAA we're on the cusp of collapse. And the question then becomes, how do you sustain or how do you put on the table either a 7-inch package or a stream of weight, because like adding another 5,000 people into the economy without income right now doesn't make sense. So you would want to give those people a year or so to recover from the blow and retrain themselves and come into the economy later. So the same goes with any other public company, that while you might want to dispose of them now, how are you going to deal with the kind of shock to the economy that will come out and the shock to incomes that will come out from doing that right now? So in a sense, you want to certainly move to the direction of the state getting out of, in my view, obvious areas where it shouldn't be, like aviation. The more complex issues are about water and roads and electricity and the really massive utilities in the country. And I don't think the right way to think about those issues are private versus public. I think it's, I mean, private versus public is one issue, but it's a question of how do you regulate those industries in a way that gets value for consumers and balances a whole bunch of imperatives. So even if you privatize Eskom, you would still have to regulate it, the electricity sector, and that would be the fundamental issue. So again, those are huge and complex and require a lot of state capacity, and I'm not convinced we can do that now. I think we should focus on responding to the virus as government. On going to the IMF, I think there will be obvious immediate lines of credit that have very little conditionality, and I don't see why COSATU or anyone else should be against that. I think that the president has provided leadership on that, so I expect that to go well. But beyond those initial pots of money, we have various sources of external credit that have various conditionalities attached to them. One of them is the IMF, another is China. And we should be going in with eyes wide open about all the conditionalities imposed by all of these external creditors that threaten to lock us into positions that we may not be able to sustain. So that will be much more difficult. I think for the initial crisis response, we can raise $20 billion globally or something in that order, which is a lot of money for a fiscal response without much conditions. But if we're going to be in a position of debt distress after this and have to have an IMF kind of program, a structural adjustment program, that of course is a different order of business. And my apologies, I forgot your first question.
How would you cut the budget? So where do you see getting the 100 billion?
I must say I was a bit surprised by that figure. It sounds like a lot, and I would imagine. So I mean, take for example the housing budget. The budget that is transferred to provinces who manage the handout of RDP housing subsidies. You could shift that 40 billion into some other function for this year alone. I mean, you couldn't do it permanently without massive problems, but you could do it for, I don't see why, in principle, you couldn't do it for this year. And I mean, of course, there are people in Treasury who might have more detailed knowledge of this particular area, but you could say, okay, the housing program this year, we're not going to issue new subsidies. We're going to shift that money elsewhere. We'll resume issuing subsidies next year. So there are a number of elements of expenditure like that where you don't have to build RDP houses this year. And of course, that has may have a consequence for contractors in the construction sector who build RDP houses, who are kind of the beneficiaries of that flow of money ultimately. But that's a trade-off you can make. The same goes for, I imagine if they're talking 130 billion, quite frankly, I don't see how they're going to do that without paying basic salary only. In other words, don't pay housing allowance, don't pay GEPF contributions either from the employer, but maybe even from the employees. So the basic salary is like 60% of the budget. So on a temporary basis, if you only do that for 1 year, those kind of things can be done. But I look forward to seeing how they add up the 130 billion.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Gina and Lumkile to come in again as we head towards the end. A burning issue. You can have 2 or 3 minutes to make an additional point or respond to Michael or ask another question. Lumkile, 3 minutes, not more.
So my worry is that in the new social compact that's being drafted, it is reminiscent of the pre-1994 compact. So things that you should worry about are, again, another elite compact, which in fact is so preoccupied with health as well as the economy, and does not seek to build a new economy that will be inclusive, that will lead to really closing the gap of inequality, but also reducing poverty at a much faster pace, so that in 10 years, we've got a very different economy, with a different society, and this society can grow together, unlike have a very clear division that's been exposed by the pandemic, that was so divided. We haven't done much in really bringing in the historical advantage in the economy. And the time is now for us to think differently and do something much better for everyone. So I'm hoping that my pessimism is proven wrong. Thank you.
Okay, and from my side, maybe let me try to pull some of the socioeconomics, a lot of what Lumkile just mentioned, into potentially the capital market reaction, bond markets, foreign investors, etc. I mean, I do speak and deal with many of those. I think what South Africans forget often is that the bond investors that we're seeing more and more of, they don't just invest in South Africa, they invest in emerging markets. That means they have actually suspected for a very long time that at some point we would have to become relatively less orthodox in our policies. Because when it comes to flattening the actual curve we need to flatten, which is inequality, that is seen as a very good thing for South Africa's future, which would be the long end of the curve, if of course it's done with very appropriate, sensible policies. I think Michael speaks to all of those. I think we often jump as soon as we hear that, oh, maybe we won't approach the IMF, but we could potentially look at pension funds. You know, we tend to go right to the extreme and start talking about the very most extreme version of prescribed assets. Whereas if you start reading Michael's paper, you can actually see that if you come together in a coordinated, sensible approach, there is a way that you can start to use some of the buffers that we've built up in South Africa. And believe me, that is not necessarily seen as a bad thing. Your emerging market bond investors invested in South Africa have seen far less orthodox policies in other emerging markets. And again, to stress, the SARB gives us a huge amount of credibility, but at the same time, our general institutional strength in South Africa is still quite high. If you look just through the rating agencies scoring, whether we like what the rating agencies do or not, I think it's very fair to see them score institutional strength still 2 notches into investment grade. So therefore, you can see the gap we have between what our fundamentals are offering us in terms of credit worthiness versus the institutional strength we can still build off. And so I think we need to realize that there might be a bit more appetite to see South Africa doing things differently. Key to this, though, is transparency, communication, and trying to get a little bit ahead of the curve. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, our finance minister will finally address us. And thank goodness we got the stimulus response this week, because up until this week, we were one of the few countries around the world that actually had not responded yet. But now, because we have, we're starting to move up the scale in terms of the IMF's fiscal monitor, for example. And that immediately reduces risk premium on South Africa, even if only for the short term until we can prove ourselves. So that's my final burning issue.
Great. I'm going to ask Michael a big question and then ask the 3 of you a question as well to end. So, Michael, how do you see, on the one hand, South Africa's responded with a bazooka, and I think there'd be general sort of support for the sort of scale of the response, but we have a weak and corrupt state after 9-10 years of state capture and wholesale corruption and incompetence, all the issues we know about. So what is your confidence when we're told we're going to spend a lot of money on infrastructure? We're going to spend 20 billion on helping municipalities with water and all sorts of essentials. I'm in favor of this, but this is probably one of the weakest parts of the state. How are we going to make sure we get value for money? And then, of course, the question nobody's really asking, which is how do we get value for money on all the health expenditure? And can we ramp up, you know, do the right things there, ramp up testing and so on and so forth. So a big question about, on the one hand, one can say I support all this money because of the nature of the pandemic, but will the state, will we get value for money sufficient for what we're trying to achieve? So that's my big question to you. Perhaps you could respond to that, and then a quick last 1-minute round to all 3 of you.
So I think so. Today we've been talking a lot about finance and the fiscal and the finance and the budget. But you know, by the end of my period in the budget office, I was more or less convinced that the budget is largely irrelevant to what happens in the world, because there are other constraints that are much more important than finance that will hamper, for instance, our health response. So our health response will be hampered by human resources, organizational capacity, the division between the private sector and the public sector, the absence of machinery and equipment and physical infrastructure. So there's all kinds of constraints that will undermine our health response that we can do very little about right now, and simply throwing the money at the problem isn't going to solve them. More broadly, I think one of the positives of the crisis, I was listening to the radio this morning and I kept hearing adverts, I think it was on 702, saying, avoid fake news, come to 702 and hear the real, whatever it was. So I think the way the pandemic has restored the balance between the political exigencies on the one hand and technical expert leadership within the state on the other hand, opens a huge potential for rebuilding state capacity. Because in my view, corruption and all of the things you mentioned are part of the problem. But really, there's a wider agenda of dissolving the technical capacity of the state in order to subordinate it to party political interest. I think we need to reconstruct the balance between that is there. It's out of balance, and the kind of the way that you've seen the Minister of Health engage around with as a professional, but also a politician, is exactly what we need to see coming more into the economic sphere, which is sadly has been lacking. So I think, again, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know. Health procurement is going to be a massive, massive issue. And how are we going to suddenly get value for money now? Let's see. Let's see what happens. But it's kind of like we have the state that we have, not the one we would wish to have. And I don't have any further concluding remarks. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Got a few more minutes. I don't know, each one of you bump into the president in the lift. You've got that sort of the elevator pitch. And after you've said, which I think most people that I know would say that he's shown strong leadership and you've been positive about that, what would be the one piece of advice that you want him to worry about or think about or act on? Gina.
I would literally say go for gold here. Don't be too concerned about your political timeline in front of you. There's obviously a need for a second term with any presidency. If you want to enact reforms, it helps to create a sustainable path for reforms. But at the same time, don't allow things such as the local elections next year, things such as the ANC's National General Council, which obviously has to take place. Obviously, these are important events, and unity within the governing ruling party is important. But this is not the time to give in to the needs and wants of politicians. This is the time to give in to the needs and wants of the people of the country, particularly those who are suffering. So I think that would be my elevator response to Ramaphosa. I'd also ask him if he might be willing to redo his mask at the end of every statement he makes. I quite enjoyed that.
Great, thank you. Lumkile?
A great job, Mr. President, on the health and well-being, which I think has allowed us to be proactive in the future in dealing with communicable diseases. Now, Mr. President, can you please deal with the climate crisis, because it's impacting on work, on livelihoods, particularly in this environment of changing technical world. Thank you.
Thanks, Lumkile. Michael, a final thought or?
I think I've said enough for today.
Okay. Thanks very much. A fantastic panel. Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing with us and spending time with us today. Sorry, we had some technical issues in the middle, but everyone can read your slides and the paper on the CDE website from now on. And thank you very much to Lumkile and to Gina for coming to join us and for responding to Michael and participating. And thank you to everybody who listened in. And this was great. We have another webinar next week on the issue of small business, US experience post-COVID, and South African experience. So do join us then. Thank you very much, and have a good weekend in isolation. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Lumkile. Gina.